The numbers crossing my desk recently reveal a paradox that should terrify anyone whose retirement strategy relies on a traditional corporate trajectory. Dario Amodi, the CEO of Anthropic, recently went on record stating that artificial intelligence could automate or eliminate between 40 and 60% of entry-level white-collar positions within the next 5 years. Yet, if we pull the latest JOLTS report and the Bureau of Labor Statistics data from early 2026, we see a labor market that is not uniformly contracting. Instead, the United States is facing a critical deficit of roughly 500,000 highly skilled technical tradespeople. We are witnessing a systemic divergence where the credentialed class is facing structural irrelevance, while the individuals capable of maintaining physical infrastructure are commanding unprecedented market power. This is not merely a cyclical fluctuation in hiring trends. It is a fundamental repricing of human capital. And to understand the brutality of this correction, we have to look away from Wall Street and examine the forensic pathology of collapsed economies. When we analyze the hyperinflationary implosion of Yugoslavia between 1992 and 1994, where the dinar disintegrated at a peak monthly inflation rate of 313 million%, a distinct pattern emerges. The state banking apparatus seized. The formal commercial networks vanished. But the economy did not simply stop. It reorganized itself around a brutal physical reality. State-employed intellectuals, academics, and bureaucrats, those who believed their academic credentials insulated them from the chaos, were instantly impoverished. Their salaries, paid in a phantom currency, could not secure a loaf of bread. Conversely, the individuals who could bypass the dying monetary system entirely, the mechanics who kept aging vehicles running, the informal currency brokers operating a parallel Deutsche Mark economy, suddenly held the actual economic leverage. They were not paid in useless paper. They commanded tangible assets and essential services. This is the exact same forensic signature we find in the economic autopsy of Weimar Germany between 1921 and 1923. As the exchange rate plummeted from 75 marks to the dollar down to an incomprehensible 4.2 trillion marks to the dollar, institutional employment became economically worthless, faster than the currency itself. A university professor's lifetime of academic achievement evaporated in a single afternoon. Meanwhile, a plumber in Berlin wasn't transacting in marks. He was transacting in coal and sausage and firewood. He had hardwired his skills directly into the survival economy, entirely bypassing the hyperinflationary destruction of the Fiat system. What history relentlessly demonstrates, and what the current data is whispering right now, is that a university degree is not a hard asset. It is a derivative. It is a financial instrument whose value is entirely dependent on the continuous, frictionless operation of the underlying institutional infrastructure. When the corporate hierarchies flatten out through AI automation, or when the monetary system fractures under the weight of sustained inflation and geopolitical realignments, the institutions that legitimize those credentials begin to fail. And when the institution fails, the derivative goes to zero. You are left holding a piece of paper that no longer corresponds to the actual demands of the real economy. The question we must ask ourselves is not whether the market will correct, but rather what happens to the balance of power when the systems that confer status suddenly lose their authority. To truly comprehend the sheer fragility of this shifting power dynamic, we must dissect the architectural difference between an underlying asset and a derivative. The economist Tim Harford, in his analysis of complex systems, emphasizes the critical survival metric of modularity, the ability of a component to decouple from the larger apparatus and continue functioning independently when the macrostructure fails. Your formal credential, in almost all modern contexts, is the antithesis of modularity. An investment banker requires a functioning clearinghouse, liquid capital markets, and stable counterparty risk to generate yield. A corporate litigator requires a solvent operational judicial system. When the systemic infrastructure fractures, the white-collar professional discovers an uncomfortable truth. They do not possess an intrinsic skill, they possess an institutional dependency. Consider the brutal calculus of Havana in 1993 during what was officially termed the Special Period. Following the immediate dissolution of the Soviet Union, Cuba lost 80% of its oil imports and experienced a 34% contraction in gross domestic product almost overnight. In this environment, a physician, theoretically holding the most universally respected and necessary credential in human history, found themselves facing a structural impossibility. With hospitals lacking basic anesthetics, antibiotics, and often reliable electricity, the vast institutional machinery required to convert that medical degree into economic value had evaporated. Confronted with this reality, approximately 10,000 highly trained Cuban doctors made the highly rational, albeit grim, calculation to drive taxis or enter the informal service sector. Their credentials became functionally worthless, not because medicine wasn't needed, but because the supply chains that supported the practice of modern medicine had severed. We see the exact same institutional decoupling mapped across the Argentine sovereign debt crisis of 2001. When the government defaulted on $93 billion of debt, the largest default in recorded history at that time, the formal economy effectively froze. In the vacuum left by the collapsing peso and a paralyzed banking sector, a massive parallel economy emerged known as the Trueque. At its peak, this national barter network facilitated the daily survival of 6 million Argentines trading localized goods and services. If we examine the economic forensics of the Trueque networks, the individuals extracting the highest exchange value were not the credentialed professionals from Buenos Aires financial districts. They were the individuals bringing tangible production skills, food preservation techniques, and mechanical repair capabilities to the market. The knowledge of how to mend or preserve a physical asset bypassed the dying fiat system entirely and became the new currency. This historical data exposes the hidden counter-cyclical nature of the repair and maintenance economy. During periods of macroeconomic expansion and artificially cheap credit, capital flows toward the continuous replacement of assets. Society discards and buys new. However, when global supply chains contract and inflation destroys purchasing power, the barrier to replacing durable goods becomes prohibitively high. The mechanic, the electrician, the individual who can extend the life cycle of existing physical infrastructure is no longer providing a fungible commodity service. They become an essential node of capital preservation. The demand for their labor inverses the broader economic contraction, meaning they are not merely surviving the business cycle, they are actively shorting the dysfunction of the system itself. But if the collapse of institutional dependencies violently rearranges the hierarchy of labor, it triggers an even more profound mutation in how a society measures value. Because long before a nation's supply chains completely cease, the very medium we use to communicate economic reality, the fiat currency sitting in your bank account, begins to transmit fundamentally false signals. And when a fiat currency enters this terminal phase, what is actually being destroyed is not merely its purchasing power, but the fundamental price signal of the economy itself. In a functioning system, price is the communication network that coordinates human labor and resource allocation. When that network is flooded with the static of structural inflation, the official currency becomes noise rather than signal. We witnessed this systemic collapse in Lebanon between 2019 and 2023, where the lira, stubbornly pegged at 1,500 to the dollar by the state, violently unraveled to an agonizing 89,000 to the dollar in the real world. We see it in the systemic informalization of Venezuela, where over 65% of all transactions had migrated to foreign currency and stablecoins by 2021. In these environments, the economy does not die, it simply fragments. A dual monetary reality emerges, the visible state-enforced system that is mathematically bleeding out, and the parallel, adaptive system where real commerce breathes. Within this friction, we find the most critical and perhaps the most misunderstood financial capability in economic history: monetary translation. On the corners of Florida Street in Buenos Aires, informal dollar traders known as arbolitos operate in open defiance of government currency controls. They buy United States dollars at the black market rate and sell at a premium, navigating a spread that has historically exceeded 60% against the official state peg. In the devastated financial landscape of Lebanon, the informal sarraf exchange brokers became the indispensable capillaries of commerce when the central banking arteries had entirely hardened. These individuals are routinely dismissed by formal institutions as mere black market speculators. This is a severe miscategorization. They are decentralized liquidity nodes. They possess the rare, lethal ability to read price differentials across competing monetary regimes in real time, translating value between the dying fiat signal and the emerging store of value. They facilitate the survival of the real economy when the institutional clearinghouses fail. This localized phenomenon is precisely what Ray Dalio identified in his autopsy of shifting world orders, noting that the final stage of a reserve currency's decline is not a sudden rupture, but a period of accelerating monetary fragmentation. And this brings us to the data crossing our desks right now, which suggests this fragmentation is no longer confined to the developing world. If we examine the macro flows of the last decade, culminating in the institutional data published in late 2025 and early 2026, a chilling parallel emerges. Global central banks have systematically reduced the proportion of United States dollars in their foreign exchange reserves by 12%. Simultaneously, we have witnessed an aggressive, historic accumulation of physical gold by sovereign institutions, a structural shift that pushed the asset well past the $4,000 per ounce threshold. What the mainstream financial press characterizes as a temporary geopolitical hedge is, in reality, a macro-scale execution of the exact same monetary translation practiced by the arbolitos in Argentina. Sovereign states are acting as their own independent liquidity nodes, quietly arbitraging the gap between a debt-burdened, weaponized fiat system and the undeniable gravity of hard assets. They are securing their purchasing power before the institutional structures mediating the fiat regime face their ultimate stress test. If the apex predators of global finance are actively positioning for systemic fragmentation, it forces a rather uncomfortable audit of the architecture of your own wealth. When the currency itself becomes an unreliable metric, how exactly do you construct a portfolio that cannot be inflated away, automated into obsolescence, or legislated out of existence? The answer lies in fundamentally redefining what constitutes a real asset in an era of institutional decay. To construct a portfolio that is genuinely institution-proof, we must look at the structural mechanics of survival during the collapse of the Soviet Union. In the summer of 1992, the Russian formal economy was undergoing a catastrophic disintegration. State pensions were vaporizing under an annualized inflation rate of 2,600%, and grocery shelves in major municipalities were barren. Yet the nation averted a catastrophic famine due almost entirely to a decentralized microagricultural network known as the Dacha system. By 1992, roughly 71% of Russian households cultivated these small, privately managed plots of land. What is mathematically staggering is that these households, operating on perhaps 3% of the nation's total arable land, produced 92% of Russia's domestic potato crop and 77% of its vegetables. The critical takeaway from the Dacha phenomenon is not a romanticized call to agrarian survivalism. The macroeconomic lesson is that the ultimate hedge against fiat degradation is the localized ownership of production and maintenance capabilities that operate entirely outside of state logistics. The academic economists in Moscow, who merely owned land as a status symbol, starved alongside their neighbors. It was the active, internalized knowledge of food preservation and agricultural yields that served as the true currency. You cannot inflate away the physical yield of a harvest, just as you cannot freeze a bank account that holds the operational knowledge of mechanical repair. For the contemporary capital allocator observing the structural shifts of 2026, this historical precedent provides a blueprint for an institution-proof portfolio. While sovereign wealth funds and central banks stockpile physical gold to defend their balance sheets against the weaponization of the dollar, the individual strategist must also secure operational resilience. This means deploying capital to control micro-supply chains, investing in independent energy generation like localized solar grids, and acquiring equity in the businesses that maintain core physical infrastructure. When the Bureau of Labor Statistics projects massive, sustained demand for HVAC technicians, commercial electricians, and solar photovoltaic installers, it is not merely signaling a tight labor market. It is quantifying the premium that society must pay to maintain its physical reality as its digital and financial abstractions begin to fail. Allocating capital into these sectors is effectively holding a long position on systemic friction. We are standing at the exact intersection where the derivative wealth of the credentialed class is being vaporized by technological displacement, while the underlying assets of the physical world are being violently repriced upward. The systems that promise to protect your purchasing power in exchange for your compliance are visibly fracturing. History does not offer guarantees, but it does offer relentless, unyielding patterns, and the pattern here is undeniable. The institutions are failing, and the individuals who outsourced their survival to those institutions will pay the ultimate price of that dependency. I want to test the gravity of this reality against your immediate surroundings, bypassing the official government inflation metrics entirely. Sometime this week, I want you to look up the current hourly rate of a licensed independent plumber or heavy equipment mechanic in your specific zip code and leave that number in the comments below. We are going to build our own localized barometer of real service inflation, and I suspect the data you provide will tell us exactly how rapidly the transfer of economic power is already taking place.